Welcome to the 10th installment of this reading of Madame Bovary. Part 2, Chapter 15. The crowd was reading against the wall, symmetrically enclosed between the balustrades. At the corner of the neighboring streets, huge bills repeated in quaint letters, Lucie de la Mamour, la Gardie, Opera, etc. The weather was fine. The people were hot. Perspiration trickled amid the curls, and handkerchiefs taken from pockets were mopping red foreheads, and now and then a warm wind that blew from the river gently stirred the border of the thick awnings hanging from the doors of the public houses. A little lower down, however, one was refreshed by a current of icy air that smelled of tallow, leather, and oil. This was an exhalation from the Rue des Charrettes, full of large black warehouses, where they made casks. For fear of seeming ridiculous, Emma, before going in, wished to have a little stroll in the harbour, and Bovary prudently kept his tickets in his hand, in the pocket of his trousers, which he pressed against his stomach. Her heart began to beat as soon as she reached the vestibule. She involuntarily smiled with vanity on seeing the crowd rushing to the right by the other corridor while she went up the stairs to the reserved seats. She was as pleased as a child. Push with a finger the large tapestried door. She breathed in with all her might the dusty smell of the lobbies, and when she was seated in her box, she bent forward with the air of a duchess. The theatre was beginning to fill. Opera glasses were taken from their cases, and the subscribers, catching sight of one another, were bowing. They came to seek relaxation in the fine arts after the anxieties of business. But business was not forgotten. They still talked cottons, spirits of wine, or indigo. The heads of old men were to be seen inexpressive and peaceful, with their hair and complexions looking like silver medals tarnished by steam of lead. The young beaux were strutting about in the pit, showing in the opening of their waistcoats their pink or apple-green cravats, and Madame Bovary from above admired them, leaning on their canes with golden knobs in the open palm of their yellow gloves. Now the lights of the orchestra were lit, the lustre let down from the ceiling, throwing by the glimmering of its facets a sudden gaiety over the theatre. Then the musicians came in one after the other, and first there was the protracted hubbub of the basses grumbling, violins squeaking, cornets trumpeting, flutes and flageolets fiffing. But 3 knocks were heard on the stage, a rolling of drums began. The brass instruments played some chords, and the curtain rising discovered a country scene. It was the crossroads of a wood, with a fountain shaded by an oak to the left. Peasants and lords with plates on their shoulders were singing a hunting song together. Then a captain suddenly came on, who evoked the spirit of evil by lifting both his arms to heaven. Another appeared, they went away, and the hunters started afresh. She felt herself transported to the reading of her youth, into the midst of Walter Scott. She seemed to hear through the mist the sound of the Scotch bagpipes re-echoing over the heather. Then her remembrance of the novel helping her to understand the libretto. She followed the story phrase by phrase, while vague thoughts that came back to her dispersed at once again with the burst of music. She gave herself up to the lullaby of the melodies, and felt all her being vibrate as if the violin bows were drawn over her nerves. She had not eyes enough to look at the costumes, the scenery, the actors, the painted trees that shook when anyone walked, and the velvet caps, cloaks, swords, all those imaginary things that floated amid the harmony as in the atmosphere of another world. But a young woman stepped forward, throwing a purse to a squire in grain. She was left alone, and the flute was heard like the murmur of a fountain or the warbling of birds. Lucy attacked her cavatina in G major bravely. She plained of love. She longed for wings. Emma, too, fleeing from life, would have liked to fly away in an embrace. Suddenly, Edgar Lajardy appeared. He had that splendid pallor that gives something of the majesty of marble to the ardent races of the South. His vigorous form was tightly clad in a brown-colored doublet. A small chiseled poniard hung against his left thigh, and he cast round laughing looks showing his white teeth. They said that a Polish princess, having heard him sing one night on the beach at Biarritz, where he mended boats, had fallen in love with him. He had deserted her for other women, and this sentimental celebrity did not fail to enhance his artistic reputation. The diplomatic murmur took care always to slip into his advertisements some poetic phrase on the fascination of his person and the susceptibility of his soul. A fine organ, imperturbable coolness, more temperament than intelligence, more power of emphasis than of real singing, made up the charm of this admirable charlatan nature, in which there was something of the hairdresser and of the toreador. From the first scene he evoked enthusiasm. He pressed Lucy in his arms. He left her. He came back. He seemed desperate. He had outbursts of rage, then elegiac gurglings of infinite sweetness, and the notes escaped from his bare neck full of sobs and kisses. Emma leant forward to see him, clutching the velvet of the box with her nails. She was filling her heart with these melodious lamentations that were drawn out to the accompaniment of double basses, like the cries of the drowning in the tumult of a tempest. She recognized all the intoxication and the anguish that had almost killed her. The voice of a prima donna seemed to her to be but echoes of her conscience, and the illusion that charmed her as some very thing of her own life. But no one on earth had loved her with such love. He had not wept like Edgar that last moonlit night when they said, "Tomorrow, tomorrow." The theatre rang with cheers. They recommenced the entire movement. The lovers spoke of flowers on their tomb, of vows, exile, fate, hopes. And when they uttered the final adieu, Emma gave a sharp cry that mingled with the vibrations of the last chords. "But why," asked Bovary, "does that gentleman persecute her?" "No, no," she answered. He is her lover. Yet he vows vengeance on her family, while the other one who came on before said, I love Lucy and she loves me. Besides, he went off with her father, arm in arm. For he certainly is her father, isn't he? The ugly little man with a cock's feather in his hat. Despite Emma's explanations, as soon as the recitative duet began, in which Gilbert lays bare his abominable machinations to his master Ashton, Charles, seeing the false troth ring that is to deceive Lucy, thought it was a love gift sent by Edgar. He confessed, moreover, that he did not understand the story because of the music, which interfered very much with the words. What does it matter? Said Emma. Do be quiet. Yes, but you know, he went on, leaning against her shoulder, I like to understand things. Be quiet, she cried impatiently. Lucy advanced, half supported by her woman, a wreath of orange blossoms in her hair, and paler than the white satin of her gown. Emma dreamed of her marriage day. She saw herself at home again, amid the corn, in the little path as they walked to the church. Oh, why had not she, like this woman, resisted, implored? She, on the contrary, had been joyous, without seeing the abyss into which she was throwing herself. Ah! If in the freshness of her beauty, before the soiling of marriage and the disillusions of adultery, she could have anchored her life upon some great, strong heart, then virtue, tenderness, voluptuousness, and duty blending, she would never have fallen from so high a happiness. But that happiness, no doubt, was a lie, invented for the despair of all desire. She now knew the smallness of the passions that art exaggerated. So, striving to divert her thoughts, Emma determined now to see in this reproduction of her sorrows only a plastic fantasy, well enough to please the eye, and she even smiled internally with disdainful pity when at the back of the stage, under the velvet hangings, a man appeared in a black cloak. His large Spanish hat fell at a gesture he made, and immediately the instruments and the singers began the sextet. Edgar, flashing with fury, dominated all the others with his clearer voice. Ashton hurled homicidal provocations at him in deep notes. Lucy uttered her shrill plaint, Arthur at one side, his modulated tones in the middle register, and the bass of the minister pealed forth like an organ, while the voices of the women repeating his words took them up in chorus delightfully. They were all in a row gesticulating, and anger, vengeance, jealousy, terror, and stupefaction breathed forth at once from their half-opened mouths. The outraged lover brandished his naked sword. His guipure ruffle rose with jerks to the movements of his chest, and he walked from the right to left with long strides, clanking against the boards, the silver-gilt spurs of his soft boots, widening out at the ankles. He, she thought, must have an inexhaustible love to lavish it upon the crowd with such effusion. All her small fault-findings faded before the poetry of the part that absorbed her, and drawn towards this man by the illusion of the character, she tried to imagine to herself his life. That life resonant, extraordinary, splendid, and that might have been hers if fate had willed it. They would have known one another, loved one another. With him, through all the kingdoms of Europe, she would have traveled from capital to capital, sharing his fatigues and his pride, picking up the flowers thrown to him, herself embroidering his costumes. Then, each evening, at the back of a box behind the golden trellis work, she would have drunk in eagerly the expansions of this soul that would have sung for her alone from the stage. Even as he acted, he would have looked at her. But the mad idea seized her that he was looking at her. It was certain. She longed to run to his arms, to take refuge in his strength, as in the incarnation of love itself, and to say to him, to cry out, "Take me away, carry me with you, let us go, thine, thine, all my ardor and all my dreams." The curtain fell. The smell of the gas mingled with that of the breaths. The waving of the fans made the air more suffocating. Emma wanted to go out. The crowd filled the corridors, and she fell back in her armchair with palpitations that choked her. Charles, fearing that she would faint, ran to the refreshment room to get a glass of barley water. He had great difficulty in getting back to his seat, for his elbows were jerked at every step because of the glass he held in his hands. And he even spilt 3/4 on the shoulders of a Rouen lady in short sleeves, who, feeling the cold liquid running down her loins, uttered cries like a peacock, as if she were being assassinated. Her husband, who was a mill owner, railed at the clumsy fellow, and while she was with her handkerchief wiping up the stains from a handsome cherry-colored taffeta gown, he angrily muttered about indemnity, costs, reimbursement. At last, Charles reached his wife, saying to her, quite out of breath, "Ma foi, I thought I should have had to stay there. There is such a crowd, such a crowd." He added, "Just guess whom I met up there. Monsieur Léon." "Léon?" "Himself. He's coming along to pay his respects." And as he finished these words, the ex-clerk of Yonville entered the box. He held out his hand with the ease of a gentleman, and Madame Bovary extended hers, without doubt obeying the attraction of a stronger will. She had not felt it since that spring evening when the rain fell upon the green leaves, and they had said goodbye, standing at the window. But soon, recalling herself to the necessities of the situation, with an effort she shook off the torpor of her memories, and began stammering a few hurried words. "Ah, good day. What, you here?" "Silence," cried a voice from the pit, for the third act was beginning. "So you are at Rouen?" "Yes." "And since when?" "Turn them out, turn them out." People were looking at them. They were silent. But from that moment she listened no more, and the chorus of the guests, the scene between Ashton and his servant, the grand duet in D major, all were for her as far off as if the instruments had grown less sonorous, and the characters more remote. She remembered the games at cards at the druggist's, and the walk to the nurse's, the reading in the arbor, the tête-à-tête by the fireside, all that poor love, so calm and so protected, so discreet, so tender, and that she had nevertheless forgotten. And why had he come back? What combination of circumstances had brought him back into her life? He was standing behind her, leaning with his shoulders against the wall of the box. Now and again she felt herself shuddering beneath the hot breath from his nostrils, falling upon her hair. "Does this amuse you?" said he, bending over her so closely that the end of his mustache brushed her cheek. She replied carelessly, "Oh, dear me, no, not much." Then he proposed that they should leave the theater and go and take an ice somewhere. "Oh, not yet, let us stay," said Bovary. "Her hair is undone, this is going to be tragic." But the mad scene did not at all interest Emma, and the acting of the singer seemed to her exaggerated. "She screams too loud," said she, turning to Charles, who was listening. "Yes, a little," he replied, undecided between the frankness of his pleasure and his respect for his wife's opinion. Then, with a sigh, Léon said, "The heat is unbearable, yes." "Do you feel unwell?" asked Bovary. "Yes, I'm stifling. Let us go." Monsieur Léon put a long lace shawl carefully about her shoulders, and all three went off to sit down in the harbor, in the open air, outside the windows of a café. First they spoke of her illness, although Emma interrupted Charles from time to time, for fear, she said, of boring Monsieur Léon, and the latter told them that he had come to spend 2 years at Rouen in a large office, in order to get practice in his profession, which was different in Normandy and Paris. Then he inquired after Berthe, Dioméde, Mère Lefrançois, and as they had, in the husband's presence, nothing more to say to one another, the conversation soon came to an end. People coming out of the theater passed along the pavement, humming or shouting at the top of their voices, "Oh, Belange, ma Lucie." Then Léon, playing the dilettante, began to talk music. He had seen Tamburini, Rubini, Persiani, Gavisi, and compared with them, La Jardie, despite his grand outbursts, was nowhere. "Yet," interrupted Charles, who was slowly sipping his rum sherbet, "they say that he's quite admirable in the last act. I regret leaving before the end, because it was beginning to amuse me." "Why," said the clerk, "he will soon give another performance." But Charles replied that they were going back next day. "Unless," he added, turning to his wife, "you would like to stay alone, kitten?" And changing his tactics at this unexpected opportunity that presented itself to his hopes, the young man sang the praises of La Jardie in the last number. It was really superb, sublime. Then Charles insisted, "You would get back on Sunday. Come, make up your mind. You're wrong if you feel that this is doing you the least good." The tables round them, however, were emptying. A waiter came and stood discreetly near them. Charles, who understood, took out his purse. The clerk held back his arm, and did not forget to leave 2 more pieces of silver, that he may chink on the marble. "Oh, I'm really sorry," said Bovary, "about the money which you are—" The other made a careless gesture full of cordiality, and taking his hat, said, "It is settled, isn't it? Tomorrow at 6 o'clock. Charles explained once more that he could not absent himself longer, but that nothing prevented Emma. "But," she stammered with a strange smile, "I'm not sure." "Well, you must think it over. We'll see. Night brings counsel." Then to Léon, who was walking along with them, "Now that you're in our part of the world, I hope you'll come and ask us for some dinner now and then." The clerk declared he would not fail to do so, being obliged, moreover, to go to Yonville on some business for his office. And they parted before the Saint-Herblanc passage, just as the clock in the cathedral struck 11:30. Part 3, Chapter 1. Monsieur Léon, while studying law, had gone pretty often to the dancing rooms, where he was even a great success among the grisettes, who thought he had a distinguished air. He was the best mannered of the students. He wore his hair neither too long nor too short, didn't spend all his quarter's money on the first day of the month, and kept on good terms with his professors. As for excesses, he had always abstained from them, as much from cowardice as from refinement. Often, when he stayed in his room to read, or else when sitting of an evening under the lime trees of the Luxembourg, he let his coat fall to the ground, and the memory of Emma came back to him. But gradually this feeling grew weaker, and other desires gathered over it, although it still persisted through them all. For Léon did not lose all hope. There was for him, as it were, a vague promise floating in the future, like golden fruit suspended from some fantastic tree. Then, seeing her again after 3 years of absence, his passion reawakened. He must, he thought, at last make up his mind to possess her. Moreover, his timidity had worn off by contact with his gay companions, and he returned to the provinces, despising everyone who had not with varnished shoes trodden the asphalt of the boulevards. By the side of a Parisienne in her laces, in the drawing-room of some illustrious physician, a person driving his carriage and wearing many orders, the poor clerk would, no doubt, have trembled like a child. But here, at Rouen, on the harbour, with the wife of this small doctor, he felt at his ease. Sure, beforehand he would shine. Self-possession depends on its environment. We don't speak on the first floor as on the fourth, and the wealthy woman seems to have about her, to guard her virtue, all her banknotes, like a cuirass in the lining of her corset. On leaving the Bovarys the night before, Léon had followed them through the streets at a distance. Then, having seen them stop at the Croix Rouge, he turned on his heel and spent the night meditating a plan. So, the next day, about 5 o'clock, he walked into the kitchen of the inn, with a choking sensation in his throat, pale cheeks, and that resolution of cowards that stops at nothing. "The gentleman isn't in," answered the servant. This seemed to him a good omen. He went upstairs. She was not disturbed at his approach. On the contrary, she apologized for having neglected to tell him where they were staying. "Oh, I divined it," said Léon. He pretended he had been guided towards her by chance, by instinct. She began to smile, and at once, to repair his folly, Léon told her that he had spent this morning in looking for her in all the hotels, in the town one after the other. "So you have made up your mind to stay," he added. "Yes," she said, "and I am wrong. One ought not to accustom oneself to impossible pleasures when there are 1,000 demands upon one." "Oh, I can imagine." "Ah, no, for you are a man." But men, too, had had their trials. And the conversation went off into certain philosophical reflections. Emma expatiated much on the misery of earthly affections and the eternal isolation in which the heart remains entombed. To show off, or from a naive imitation of this melancholy which called forth his, the young man declared that he had been awfully bored during the whole course of his studies. The law irritated him, other vocations attracted him, and his mother never ceased worrying him in every one of her letters. As they talked, they explained more and more fully the motives of their sadness, working themselves up in their progressive confidence. But they sometimes stopped short of the complete exposition of their thought, and then sought to invent a phrase that might express it all the same. She did not confess her passion for another. He did not say that he had forgotten her. Perhaps he no longer remembered his suppers with girls after masked balls, and no doubt she did not recollect the rendezvous of old when she ran across the fields in the morning to her lover's house. The noises of the town hardly reached them, and the room seemed small, as if on purpose to hem in their solitude more closely. Emma, in a dimity dressing gown, leant her head against the back of the old armchair. The yellow wallpaper formed, as it were, a golden background behind her, and her bare head was mirrored in the glass with the white parting in the middle, and the tip of her ears peeping out from the folds of her hair. But pardon me," she said. "It is wrong of me. I weary you with my eternal complaints." "Oh, no, never, never." "If you knew," she went on, raising to the ceiling her beautiful eyes, in which a tear was trembling, "all that I had dreamed." I too have suffered. Often I went out, I went away. I dragged myself along the quays, seeking distraction amid the din of the crowd, without being able to banish the heaviness that weighed upon me. In an engraver's shop on the boulevard there is an Italian print of one of the muses. She is draped in a tunic, and she is looking at the moon, with forget-me-nots in her flowing hair. Something drove me there continually. I stayed there hours together. And then, in a trembling voice, "She resembled you a little." Madame Bovary turned away her head, that he might not see the irrepressible smile she felt rising to her lips. "Often," he went on, "I wrote you letters that I tore up." She did not answer. He continued, "I sometimes fancied that some chance would bring you. I thought I recognized you at the street corners, and I ran after all the carriages through whose windows I saw a shawl fluttering, a veil like yours." She seemed resolved to let him go on speaking without interruption. Crossing her arms and bending down her face, she looked at the rosettes on her slippers, and at intervals made little movements inside the satin of them with her toes. At last she sighed. "But the most wretched thing, is it not, is to drag out, as I do, a useless existence. If our pains were only of some use to someone, we should find consolation in the thought of the sacrifice." He started off in praise of virtue, duty, and silent immolation, having himself an incredible longing for self-sacrifice that he could not satisfy. "I should much like," she said, "to be a nurse at a hospital. Alas, men have none of these holy missions, and I see nowhere any calling, unless perhaps that of a doctor. With a slight shrug of her shoulders, Emma interrupted him to speak of her illness, which had almost killed her. What a pity. She should not be suffering now. Léon at once envied the calm of the tomb, and one evening he had even made his will, asking to be buried in that beautiful rug with velvet stripes he had received from her. For this was how they would have wished to be, each setting up an ideal to which they were now adapting their past life. Besides, speech is a rolling mill that always thins out the sentiment. But at this invention of the rug, she asked, "But why?" "Why?" He hesitated. "Because I love you so." And congratulating himself at having surmounted the difficulty, Léon watched her face out of the corner of his eyes. It was like the sky when a gust of wind drives the clouds across. The mass of sad thoughts that darkened them seemed to be lifted from her blue eyes. Her whole face shone. He waited. At last she replied, "I always suspected it." Then they went over all the trifling events of that far-off existence, whose joys and sorrows they had just summed up in one word. They recalled the arbor with clematis, the dresses she had worn, the furniture of her room, the whole of her house. "And our poor cactuses, where are they? Oh, the cold killed them this winter." "Ah, how I have thought of them, do you know? I often saw them again as of yore, when on the summer mornings the sun beat down upon your blinds, and I saw your two bare arms passing out amongst the flowers." "Oh, poor friend," she said, holding out her hand to him. Léon swiftly pressed his lips to it. Then, when he had taken a deep breath, "At that time you were to me, I know not what incomprehensible force that took captive my life. Once, for instance, I went to see you, but you, no doubt, do not remember it." "I do," she said. "Go on." "You were downstairs in the ante-room, ready to go out, standing on the last stair. You were wearing a bonnet with small blue flowers, and without any invitation from you, in spite of myself, I went with you. Every moment, however, I grew more and more conscious of my folly, and I went on walking by you, not daring to follow you completely, and unwilling to leave you when you went into a shop. I waited in the street, and I watched you through the window taking off your gloves and counting the change on the counter. Then you rang at Madame Bovary's. You were let in, and I stood like an idiot in front of the great heavy door that had closed after you." Madame Bovary, as she listened to him, wondered that she was so old. All these things reappeared before her, seemed to widen out her life. It was like some sentimental immensity to which she returned. And from time to time, she said in a low voice, her eyes half closed, "Yes, it is true, true, true." They heard 8 strike on the different clocks of the Beauvoisin quarter, which is full of schools, churches, and large empty hotels. They no longer spoke, but they felt as they looked upon each other a buzzing in their heads, as if something sonorous had escaped from the fixed eyes of each of them. They were hand in hand now, and the past, the future, reminiscences and dreams, all were confounded in the sweetness of this ecstasy. Night was darkening over the walls, on which still shone, half hidden in the shade, the coarse colors of 4 bills representing 4 scenes from the Tour de Nestlé, with a motto in Spanish and French at the bottom. Through the sash window a patch of dark sky was seen, between the pointed roofs. She rose to light 2 wax candles on the drawers. Then she sat down again. "Well," said Léon. "Well," she replied. He was thinking how to resume the interrupted conversation when she said to him, "How is it that no one until now has ever expressed such sentiments to me?" The clerk said that ideal natures were difficult to understand. He, from the first moment, had loved her, and he had despaired when he thought of the happiness that would have been theirs. If, thanks to fortune, meeting her earlier, they had been indissolubly bound to one another. "I have sometimes thought of it," she went on. "What a dream," murmured Léon. And fingering gently the blue binding of her long white sash, he added, "And who prevents us from beginning now?" "No, my friend," she replied. "I am too old. You are too young. Forget me. Others will love you. You will love them." "Not as you," he cried. "What a child you are. Come, let us be sensible. I wish it." She showed him the impossibility of their love, and that they must remain, as formerly, on the simple terms of a fraternal friendship. Was she speaking thus seriously? No doubt Emma did not herself know, quite absorbed as she was by the charm of the seduction, and the necessity of defending herself from it. And contemplating the young man with a moved look, she gently repulsed the timid caresses that his trembling hands attempted. "Ah, forgive me," he cried, drawing back. Emma was seized with a vague fear at this shyness, more dangerous to her than the boldness of Rodolphe when he advanced to her open-armed. No man had ever seemed to her so beautiful. An exquisite candor emanated from his being. He lowered his long, fine eyelashes that curled upwards. His cheek, with the soft skin, reddened. She thought with desire of her person, and Emma felt an invincible longing to press her lips to it. Then, leaning towards the clock as if to see the time, "Ah, how late it is," she said. "How we do chatter." And he understood the hint and took up his hat. "It has even made me forget the theatre. And poor Bovary has left me here especially for that. Monsieur Lomeray of the Rue Grapon was to take me and his wife. And the opportunity was lost, as she was to leave the next day." "Really?" said Léon. "Yes. But I must see you again," he went on. "I wanted to tell you." "What?" "Something important, serious." "Oh, no. Besides, you will not go. It is impossible. If you should, listen to me. Then you have not understood me. You have not guessed." "Yet you speak plainly," said Emma. "Ah, you can jest. Enough, enough. Oh, for pity's sake, let me see you once. Only once." "Well," she stopped. Then, as if thinking better of it, "Oh, not here." "Where you will." "Will you—" she seemed to reflect, then abruptly, "tomorrow at 11 o'clock in the cathedral." "I shall be there," he cried, seizing her hands, which she disengaged. And as they were both standing up, he behind her, and Emma with her head bent, he stooped over her and pressed long kisses on her neck. "You are mad. Oh, you are mad," she said, with sounding little laughs, while the kisses multiplied. Then, bending his head over her shoulder, he seemed to beg the consent of her eyes. They fell upon him full of an icy dignity. Léon stepped back to go out. He stopped on the threshold. Then he whispered with a trembling voice, Tomorrow? She answered with a nod, and disappeared like a bird into the next room. In the evening, Emma wrote the clerk an interminable letter in which she cancelled the rendezvous. All was over. They must not, for the sake of their happiness, meet again. But when the letter was finished, as she did not know Leon's address, she was puzzled. "I'll give it to him myself," she said. "He will come." The next morning, at the open window and humming on his balcony, Leon himself varnished his pumps with several coatings. He put on white trousers, fine socks, a green coat, emptied all the scent he had into his handkerchief. Then, having had his hair curled, he uncurled it again, in order to give it a more natural elegance. It is still too early, he thought, looking at the hairdresser's cuckoo clock that pointed to the hour of 9. He read an old-fashioned journal, went out, smoked a cigar, walked up 3 streets, thought it was time, and went slowly towards the porch of Notre Dame. It was a beautiful summer morning. Silver plate sparkled in the jeweller's windows, and the light falling obliquely on the cathedral made mirrors of the corners of the grey stones. A flock of birds fluttered in the grey sky round the trefoil bell turrets. The square, resounding with cries, was fragrant with the flowers that bordered its pavement: roses, jasmines, pinks, narcissi, and tuberoses, unevenly spaced out between moist grasses, catmint, and chickweed for the birds. The fountains gurgled in the center, and under large umbrellas, amidst melons piled up in heaps, flower women, bareheaded, were twisting paper round bunches of violets. The young man took one. It was the first time that he had bought flowers for a woman, and his breast, as he smelt them, swelled with pride, as if this homage that he had meant for another had recoiled upon himself. But he was afraid of being seen. He resolutely entered the church. The beadle, who was just then standing on the threshold in the middle of the left doorway under the dancing Marianne, with feather cap and rapier dangling against his claves, came in, more majestic than a cardinal, and as shining as a saint on a holy pyx. He came towards Leon, and with that smile of wheedling benignity assumed by ecclesiastics when they question children. The gentleman no doubt does not belong to these parts. The gentleman would like to see the curiosities of the church." "No," said the other, and he first went round the lower aisles. Then he went out to look at the Place. Emma was not coming yet. He went up again to the choir. The nave was reflected in the full fonts, with the beginning of the arches and some portions of the glass windows. But the reflections of the paintings, broken by the marble rim, were continued farther on upon the flagstones, like a many-colored carpet. The broad daylight from without streamed into the church in 3 enormous rays from the 3 opened portals. From time to time, at the upper end, a sacristan passed, making the oblique genuflection of devout persons in a hurry. The 3 crystal lustres hung motionless. In the choir, a silver lamp was burning, and from the side chapels and dark places of the church sometimes rose sounds like sighs, with the clang of a closing grating, its echo reverberating under the lofty vault. Leon, with solemn steps, walked along by the walls. Life had never seemed so good to him. She would come directly, charming, agitated, looking back at the glances that followed her, and with her flounced dress, her gold eyeglass, her thin shoes with all sort of elegant trifles that he had never enjoyed, and with the ineffable seduction of yielding virtue. The church like a huge boudoir spread around her, the arches bent down together in the shade, the confession of her love. The windows shone resplendent to illuminate her face, and the censers would burn that she might appear like an angel amid the fumes of the sweet-smelling odors. But she did not come. He sat down on a chair, and his eyes fell upon a blue-stained window, representing boatmen carrying baskets. He looked at it long, attentively, and he counted the scales of the fish and the buttonholes of the doublets, while his thoughts wandered off towards Emma. The beadle, standing aloof, was inwardly angry at this individual, who took the liberty of admiring the cathedral by himself. He seemed to him to be conducting himself in a monstrous fashion, to be robbing him in a sort, and almost committing sacrilege. But a rustle of silk on the flags, the tip of a bonnet, a lined cloak. It was she. Léon rose and ran to meet her. Emma was pale. She walked fast. "Read," she said, holding out a paper to him. "Oh, no." And she abruptly withdrew her hand to enter the chapel of the Virgin, where, kneeling on a chair, she began to pray. The young man was irritated at this bigot fancy. Then he nevertheless experienced a certain charm in seeing her, in the middle of a rendezvous, thus lost in her devotions, like an Andalusian marchioness. Then he grew bored, for she seemed never coming to an end. Emma prayed, or rather strove to pray, hoping that some sudden resolution might descend to her from heaven. And to draw down divine aid, she filled full her eyes with the splendors of the tabernacle. She breathed in the perfumes of the full-blown flowers in the large vases, and listened to the stillness of the church that only heightened the tumult of her heart. She rose, and they were about to leave when the beadle came forward, hurriedly saying, "Madame, no doubt, does not belong to these parts. Madame would like to see the curiosities of the church?" "Oh, no," cried the clerk. "Why not?" said she. For she clung with her expiring virtue to the Virgin, the sculptures, the tombs, anything. Then, in order to proceed by rule, the beadle conducted them right to the entrance near the square, where, pointing out with his cane a large circle of blockstones without inscription or carving, "This," he said majestically, "is the circumference of the beautiful bell of Ambroise. It weighed 40,000 pounds. There was not its equal in all Europe. The workman who cast it died of the joy." "Let us go on," said Léon. The old fellow started off again. Then, having got back to the chapel of the Virgin, he stretched forth his arm with an all-embracing gesture of demonstration, and, prouder than a country squire showing you his espaliers, went on. "This simple stone covers Pierre de Breze, Lord of Varennes and of Brissac, Grand Marshal of Poitou and Governor of Normandy, who died at the Battle of Montlhéry on the 16th of July, 1465. Léon bit his lips, fuming. "And on the right, this gentleman all encased in iron, on the prancing horse, is his grandson, Louis de Breze, Lord of Préval and of Montchauvet, Count de Maulevrier, Baron de Mouny, Chamberlain to the King, Knight of the Order, and also Governor of Normandy, died on the 23rd of July, 1531, a Sunday, as the inscription specifies. And below, this figure about to descend into the tomb portrays the same person. It is not possible, is it, to see a more perfect representation of annihilation. Madame Bovary put up her eyeglasses. Léon, motionless, looked at her, no longer even attempting to speak a single word, to make a gesture. So discouraged was he at this twofolded obstinacy of gossip and indifference. The everlasting guide went on. Near him, this kneeling woman who weeps is his spouse, Diane de Poitiers, Countess de Breze, Duchess de Valentinois, born in 1499, died in 1566, and to the left, the one with the child is the Holy Virgin. Now, to turn this side, here are the tombs of the Ambroise. They were both cardinals and archbishops of Rouen. That one was minister under Louis XII. He did a great deal for the cathedral. In his will, he left 30,000 gold crowns for the poor. And without stopping, still talking, he pushed them into a chapel full of balustrades, some put away, and disclosed a kind of block that certainly might once have been an ill-made statue. Truly, he said with a groan, it adorned the tomb of Richard Coeur de Lion, King of England and Duke of Normandy. It was Calvinists, sir, who reduced it to this condition. They had buried it for spite in the earth, under the episcopal seat of Monseigneur. See? This is the door by which Monseigneur passes to his house. Let us pass on quickly to see the gargoyle windows. But Léon hastily took some silver from his pocket and seized Emma's arm. The beadle stood dumbfounded, not able to understand this untimely munificence when there were still so many things for the stranger to see. So calling him back, he cried, "Sir, sir, the steeple, the steeple." "No, thank you," said Léon. "You are wrong, sir. It is 440 feet high, 9 less than the Great Pyramid of Egypt. It is all cast. Léon was fleeing, for it seemed to him that his love, that for nearly 2 hours now had become petrified in the church like the stones, would vanish like a vapor through that sort of truncated funnel, of oblong cage, of open chimney, that rises so grotesquely from the cathedral like the extravagant attempt of some fantastic brazier. "But where are we going?" she said. Making no answer, he walked on with a rapid step, and Madame Bovary was already dipping her finger in the holy water, when behind them they heard a panting breath interrupted by the regular sound of a cane. Léon turned back. "Sir, what is it?" And he recognized the beadle, holding under his arm and balancing against his stomach some 20 large sewn volumes. They were works which treated of the cathedral. "Idiot," growled Léon, rushing out of the church. A lad was playing about the close. "Go and get me a cab." The child bounded off like a ball by the Rue Quatre-Vents. Then they were alone a few minutes, face to face, and a little embarrassed. "Ah, Léon, really, I don't know if I ought," she whispered. Then, with a more serious air, "Do you know, it is very improper." "How so?" replied the clerk. "It is done at Paris." And that, as an irresistible argument, decided her. Still, the cab did not come. Léon was afraid she might go back into the church. At last the cab appeared. "At all events, go out by the north porch," cried the beadle, who was left alone on the threshold, "so as to see the resurrection." the Last Judgment, Paradise, King David, and the condemned in hell flames. Where to, sir? Asked the coachman. Where you like, said Léon, forcing Emma into the cab. And the lumbering machine set out. It went down the Rue Grand Pont, crossed the Place d'Art, the Quai Napoleon, the Pont Neuf, and stopped short before the statue of Pierre Corneille. Go on, cried a voice that came from within. The cab went on again, and as soon as it reached the Carrefour Lafayette, set off downhill and entered the station at a gallop. No, straight on, cried the same voice. The cab came out by the gate, and soon having reached the cour, trotted quietly beneath the elm trees. The coachman wiped his brow, put his leather hat between his knees, and drove his carriage beyond the side alley, by the meadow, to the margin of the waters. It went along by the river, along the towing path, paved with sharp pebbles, and for a long while in the direction of the Oiselle, beyond the Isles. Suddenly it turned with a dash across Quatermares, Scottville, La Grande Chaussee, the Rue d'Elbeuf, and made its third halt in front of the Jardin des Plantes. Get on, will you? Cried the voice more furiously. And at once resuming its course, it passed by Saint-Sever, by the Quai de Coriandière, the Quai aux Meules, once more over the bridge, by the Place du Jean de Mars, and behind the hospital gardens, where old men in black coats were walking in the sun along the terrace, all green with ivy. It went up the Boulevard Bouvreuil, along the Boulevard Choussois, then the whole of Mont Riboudet to the Deville Hills. It came back, and then, without any fixed plan or direction, wandered about at hazard. The cab was seen at Saint-Paul, at Lescure, at Montgagat, at La Rouge-Marque, and Place de Gaillebois, in the Rue Maladerie, Rue d'Andery, before Saint-Romain, Saint-Bévien, Saint-Maclou, Saint-Nicaise, in front of the customs at the Vieux-Tour, the Trois-Pipe, and the monumental cemetery. From time to time, the coachman on his box cast despairing eyes at the public houses. He could not understand what furious desire for locomotion urged these individuals never to wish to stop. He tried to now and then, and at once exclamations of anger burst forth behind him. Then he lashed his perspiring jades afresh, but indifferent to the jolting, running up against things here and there, not caring if he did, demoralized and almost weeping with thirst, fatigue, and depression. And on the harbor, in the midst of the drays and casks, and in the streets, at the corners, the good folk opened large, wonder-stricken eyes at this sight. So extraordinary in the provinces, a cab with blinds drawn, and which appeared thus constantly shut more closely than a tomb, and tossing about like a vessel. Once, in the middle of the day, in the open country, just as the sun beat most fiercely against the old plated lanterns, a bare hand passed beneath the small blinds of yellow canvas, and threw out some scraps of paper that scattered in the wind. And farther off lighted like white butterflies on a field of red clover, all in bloom. At about 6 o'clock, the carriage stopped in a back street of the Beauvoisin quarter, and a woman got out, who walked with a veil down, and without turning her head.